No role plays, no conference calls, no BS. Chris and Lorenzo share 4 decades of combined experience to help you become a more effective leader. This is Hacking Your Leadership.
Welcome to Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lorenzo.
And welcome to this week's Thoughtful Thursday. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube at Hacking Your Leadership and leave us a review on iTunes. On this Thoughtful Thursday, I want to go over something that it's pretty common in the leadership space, is this concept of managing change. You know, change is the only constant. I've heard that my entire life, and organizations are constantly changing, and change is never an easy thing. There are some people who say they thrive on it and they love change, and I'm sure that maybe that's the case for some people. For most people, it can be stressful, even if they inherently believe the outcome on the other side is good. It can be stressful. And, you know, there's this kind of chart that has been adopted by a lot of organizations that talks about the emotional cycle that employees go through when it comes to change. And we'll put a link to it in the podcast description. But in general, employees start with denial. They move through anxiety, shock, resistance, fear, anger, frustration, confusion, and stress. Then there's this kind of transitional period where you see some creativity, some people kind of thinking about how they can adapt to these new changes and adapt them in their own role and how they can make an impact on them. Then there's some skepticism, but it's like people become cautiously optimistic. They start to accept it. Then they become impatient that other people aren't accepting it. Then they become hopeful. Then there's some energy around it. You get some enthusiasm, and then that leads right into the next change, right? So it's a constant cycle. And a lot of leaders don't manage this cycle correctly, or don't lead employees correctly through this cycle. And so I want to talk about this because I think there are different parts of this cycle that impact leaders differently. And I think it would help our listeners if we talked about some of the ways that we've kind of interacted with this cycle over the years.
Yeah, I can tell you, I think everybody goes through it. And I think that people skip through different parts of it based upon who they are, their perspective of the world, and how they process some of these things. So for me, I read through this and I'm like, yeah, I'm not quick. I like denial is the first thing. I don't know that I spend much time in the denial, the shock, the resistance. I jump right into the anger. And so because it's just kind of oh, what are we doing? This is crazy. And but I also move through that pretty quickly. So I think that having, a long career in a place like retail leadership, again, you're kind of used to this ongoing change to your part, to your point. There's always something that's changing. There's always a different approach. There's a different strategy. There's a different, way that we do things, and it's constantly being adjusted and that. So you kind of get used to okay, it's going to be what it's going to be, but what questions do I have, or how do I move quickly, knowing that I'm responsible for leading people. So I can feel a certain way about something, but also understand that if this is what we're doing organizationally, I have to make that come to life. That's actually the job that I have. And so I think sometimes for me, it's helpful to kind of work through some things quickly, no matter how much my initial reaction is, to then get to the point of the responsibility of my role as a leader. I think that helps me get through a lot of these stages very quickly.
Yeah, I think you mentioned something important here, which is the role of the leader. Meaning, if you are just an employee who doesn't have people reporting to you, then your role is whatever it is in this. You could pick your poison on where in this chart you tend to start, and the different things you can kind of pass through quickly versus the things that you kind of you dwell in longer. If you're a leader, you are still going through that as an employee, but you also have a responsibility to kind of help your people transition through the process as well. And sometimes your people will have different places on this kind of cycle that they naturally gravitate towards. And when a lot of leaders get tripped up in this, it's when they treat all of their employees in the exact same way, or they treat their employees in the way that they themselves are reacting to this. And you see this, where this kind of rears its head is when you as the employee are feeling either denial, anxiety, shock, resistance, fear, anger, frustration, any of those, and you go to your boss and the response is already at enthusiasm. like, oh, this is going to be amazing, right? So if the boss is there, it means one of two things. Either they started this process a long time ago and failed miserably to bring you along for the ride, or they're lying. They're not actually enthusiastic about it yet. They're somewhere else in this transition period, and they believe their responsibility as a leader is to exude enthusiasm in the hopes that you will kind of use their example to make it through the rest of these things. And all that does is you see right through it. As the employee, when my leader does that, I see right through that, because there's no way they're enthusiastic about something they just heard about the day before. Instead, they're trying to fake it till they make it, or they don't. Even worse, they don't care. They're enthusiastic because in their mind they've drank the Kool-Aid. It's their job, and they move through it without having to go through these things. But that isn't how you can lead a team of people who go through these actual issues. And so what I want to ask you, Lorenzo, is I want to know about where you get stuck in here. You say you kind of naturally, start at the anger / frustration phase, not really in the anxiety or shock or resistance or fear part. But as you move through these transitions, where do you get stuck as a leader, and how do you get through that in helping your people get through it as well? So I want to ask you that, but first I want to get a word from one of our sponsors. All right, Lorenzo, where do you find yourself spending the most amount of time in this transition period, and how do you help your people get through it?
No, it's a great question. I think the two places where I get stuck in this is, I think, in just the elements of the frustration piece, when I'm not connecting the dots and understanding from a long-term standpoint. Like I understand that change is necessary. I know that sometimes, many times, we have to just do things for the moment. But also my brain and the way that I'm wired, I think about like the long tail on this. Like, how is this going to have an impact long tail? And have we considered those things? And, my hope and belief is that they have been considered, but sometimes, like, I feel like this is going to cause more harm than good in the long term. So I tend to get stuck a little bit there, and slows me down. But then really for me, impatience, and specifically the impatience around, even though I might feel a certain way about this, even though I may, have this just feelings about what's going on, I firmly believe that we have this responsibility as leaders to what you said earlier, which is bring our people along, meet them where they're at, and help them work through this change. Because feeling the way that you're going to feel about it's not going to change things. Like, it's not going to change this. Like, this is the thing that we're going to go do. And so sometimes the impatience thing around other people or other leaders holding on to some of these previous emotions for too long. Right. Like, I understand that you're upset. I get that maybe you're frustrated. Yes, like I could acknowledge that people are working through these types of things, but you do have to move beyond them if we ever have a chance to get into like the ability to be creative and to figure this out and to eventually have an impact on the work itself and kind of move this forward. That for me, I think, is where I get stuck the most. It's just like giving people the time to process and work through the things, but then having some of them still stuck and not wanting to move forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's everybody gets to the acceptance phase, which is right before impatience. Everybody gets to the acceptance phase on their own timeline. And once you're there, it can be hard when the rest of your organization or your colleagues aren't there alongside you. It's possible some of them got there before you. It's possible that some of them got there before you and they were frustrated at your lack of acceptance. And then once you get there, now you get to be frustrated at their lack of acceptance. Like they're at other people in the organization. That's when you've moved kind of into the kind of impatience phase. But it's interesting how this process works, and it's whether it's a small change or a large change. It could be being fired from an organization, or it could be, hey, we're going to change this computer system from this one to this one, and it's going to change the way that you do this one process that might amount to 5% of your day job. So regardless of it, it's just the levels of these emotions are different depending on how impactful the change is to your life. But make no mistake, if you're a leader, there's going to be this transition that occurs with all of your employees, and it's your job to kind of recognize where your employees are falling along this kind of roadmap, and meeting them where they are in a way that is genuine, that doesn't give off that you are somehow immune to this phase, to this process, that you go through it as well. But you have kind of maybe a healthy history of experience of going through similar things and knowing that it's going to be okay because you've been through it before. Being able to share those experiences with your employees might help them get through that a little bit better. Devaluing their experience or getting frustrated with them for not being where you are is not the way to help them through it.
Yeah, and I want to call that out. I think I'm happy that you said that, because I think it's important to say that you can acknowledge that you have also been through some of these stages, but you cannot be dismissive in where they're at. So
right.
You cannot say like, oh, like when I first heard this too, Chris, man, I was like, what the heck is going on? So like, I totally get it, but like, let's move beyond that now. Like, no, you don't get to just stay there. Like you want to acknowledge and be like, hey, I totally understand it. Like I, initially when we have change like this, I have very similar feelings, very similar emotions. A couple things that help me kind of work through it are maybe this, and that. But this is about you right now. So what do you want to talk about, or like how do you want to kind of talk through this, or what can I share with you that might be helpful as we're considering this change in the work that we need to do. So like I think that's important, because I think that happens too. It was like, yep, hey, I get it. When I first heard it last week, I was really mad too, but like it is what it is. We are where we are. So like, let's go. Like that's not going to help you, get people through the process.
No, not at all. If by the nature of organizations is that the knowledge or the strategy trickles down. And so the higher up you are in the organization, the earlier you were able to start this process. And if you're giving the information to your people, the idea that you had 1 day or 1 week or 1 month to be able to get through this, and now you expect them to be where you are, is insane. Like you need to at least give them the leeway that you were given by your boss, and you need to also take into account that maybe you've done this before, and so it's easier to move through these things than it is for your people. Or maybe because of your position, you're impacted less by it than they are. Maybe all your job is to hold them accountable to the change that's impacting them that isn't impacting you at all. So keep that in mind too when you're kind of delivering news and you're kind of helping them get along. Allow them to move through the process in their own pace, as long as they are clearly moving through it. They can't get stuck too long in one area, but they need to be able to move through it.
Absolutely. And with that, it brings us to the end of this episode. This is Hacking Leadership. I'm Lorenzo.
And I'm Chris.
And have a great day.